Welcome to this sixth episode of The Lockdown. And today it's a great pleasure to speak to a very good friend of mine who is clearly a superstar in the field of, I would say, AI psychology or computational social sciences, Michal Kosinski. He has featured in all the main and most prestigious media outlets and has been at the center of really pioneering research around translating digital footprints into meaningful and accurate signals of personality and human psychology. But thanks to the current or recent lockdown situation, we're lucky enough that he has been in hideout, so to say. And this, I think, is a pretty exclusive and rare appearance out of the lockdown. So I'm very pleased that we are going to have a chat with Michal, and let me just welcome you first. Michal, how are you doing?
Thomas, thanks for having me. I'm doing great. I must say that while the world seems to be on fire, and of course I'm really worried about this, for me personally, those last 2 months, and this kind of shows how privileged I am, that we're just more quiet and more calm, and in some ways it was very welcome. Though of course now I have helicopters buzzing above my head, and society is being torn in many sad and unexpected ways.
Do you think the helicopters are after you, looking for you specifically, or is it just a wider context?
Just yes, making sure that I'm not breaking the quarantine. Okay. No, well, of course, it's a wider context, and I think that, you know, in a way, I'm trying to look for positive in difficult and negative times like this. But essentially, I think that the last few months just amplified the problems that we have here in American society, and that haven't been solved ever or addressed properly. And now that people essentially are pushed to the edge, and also have more time, unfortunately, and then there's a capacity. We all have more capacity to essentially try to change the world for better.
What have you learned about yourself during this lockdown period?
That's a good question. I think that it turns out that even an extrovert can spend 3 months in the living room and not go totally crazy. It turns out that I need hairdressers more than I thought. But I think that it kind of shows how privileged I am as an academic, that essentially as a researcher I can just work from home. And I'm probably one of the few lucky people that got relatively unaffected by what's happening around us.
So you found a way to keep or even increase your productivity, and happy with the new routine. Did you pick up any new hobbies? You know, a lot of people I've been speaking to learn to cook or develop new recipes, learn to play an instrument or a language. Have you kind of nurtured your curiosity outside of work?
Well, outside of work, it suddenly turns out that I can actually produce, a paper every few months, which always sounded like a mission impossible. So that's good. I must say that in some ways it also was beneficial for my social contacts and connections, that usually as an extrovert I would spend time with people in person and would really discount electronic means of communication. And now that I'm limited to electronic means of communication, it suddenly turns out that I'm staying more connected with people that I traditionally or typically in the past saw maybe once or twice a year only.
So you've been doing sort of Zoom drinks and all the usual things. Are you, do you find that stimulating, interesting? Is it equivalent or comparative to kind of the real thing?
No, I hate Zoom drinks. But I would have great chats, with family members and friends. That one-on-one chats. I never understood the Zoom party concept, and I'm not a big fan of it. But there's this insane amount of one-on-one connecting with people through Zoom. People have more time to talk to me as well, and I have more time to talk to them. So I guess that in some ways, the quality of my social interactions improved.
Yeah, okay. And let's talk a little bit about the work that you're focused on right now, the papers, the research. You know, of course, you rose to fame, I guess, with the papers that translated or showed that you could translate Facebook activity and Facebook behaviors into reliable personality profiles. I want to talk a little bit about, maybe this is a good starting point, whether computers understand us or know us better than we know ourselves, which interestingly is a point that after you, Yuval Noah Harari has been making, that maybe that's one of the fears of AI, that soon AI will know us better than we know ourselves, and then we are toast. Talk to me a little bit about, let's start there, right? So whether algorithms have a better understanding of who we are and are better able to predict ourselves than we are ourselves, or maybe even than we are other people, if we compare how a computer has a model on you versus the model that I might have of you, Michal.
Well, that's a great question. And the interesting fact here is that because we're kind of encroaching on what we humans always thought we're best at, that suddenly, at least even me, myself, have this immune reaction immediately when you say, can a computer understand your girlfriend better than you do? Well, of course it can't, because I have those unique Michal ways of understanding other people and interacting with them. But of course, it's all just an illusion that we're having. That the moment you try to define understanding someone in some measurable way, and let me just volunteer one way of defining understanding someone. If you define understanding someone as being able to predict what they're going to say or do in the future, it suddenly becomes absolutely crystal clear that computer algorithms, even simple computer algorithms, are much better than humans at predicting not only what other people are going to do, but also what I myself am going to do in the future. And this is, you know, it sounds preposterous to humans. Like, how the hell a machine can predict my future behavior better than I could do myself? Of course, I'm an expert on myself, and we are expert on ourselves for sure, but we have certain disadvantages compared with a computer. And, you know, let me give you one example here. Like, let's talk about the 3-year-old child. Of course, a parent of a 3-year-old child is much better at predicting how this child is going to behave when they are 6 or 10 or 15 than the child themselves. Why? Because the parents have seen many other people growing up from 3 to 15, and they've been 15 themselves, and they remember a bit how it was, and they kind of observe the world. They have the panorama of the world that is completely inaccessible to a 3-year-old child, and all of those experiences that the child doesn't have. And it's exactly the same with an algorithm. I may think that I'm the best at predicting how I will behave in any situation, and in particular in some situations that come in the future, but a computer algorithm has benefit of having seen literally billions of people being, you know, encountering certain situations and then reacting to them in certain ways, sometimes very unexpected to the people in question, and thus the algorithm can much better than I can predict. It turns out, and it's not just my opinion, there's just a lot of scientific evidence that computers are better at predicting our future behavior than what is achievable to us.
Why do you think there is such popular distrust or fear or maybe resistance to this idea, right? Is it the case that because humans always felt experts here, they don't want to have, you know, be challenged by computers? I mean, you know, which in a way is applied to any area, whether it was Big Blue or AlphaGo or whatever, there is a competition between machines and humans. We kind of unite as a fictitious or fictional human race and feel territorial. No, we're better. Is it that we don't want to feel stupid because we are overtaken by machines, or is there anything else here? Fears that AI might take over?
Well, I think it's not new for humans to be freaked out by a new technology. You know, think cars, think elevators, think billboards, you know, think telephones, TV, radio, all of those technologies when they were introduced. You know, the immediate predictions of doom and the end of humanity. And of course, now we got used to them and kind of domesticated those technologies a little more, and those technologies domesticated us a little more as well. And it turns out that the world is not ending anytime soon. And I think it's the same with AI. Now, the problem with AI is that it's slightly different than those other technologies, meaning that it's the first time, I think, in the history of in the recent history of human species, that we are not the smartest animal out there. And of course, there are animals that are much smarter than us in some specific ways, like, try to beat a pigeon at navigating, in the 3D space and using magnetic waves to find the way home, or try to outsmart the dog
with Google Maps, or with Google Maps, or without Google Maps, without Waze.
That's a good point. Maybe with Google Maps we can compete with a pigeon, but essentially there are animals that are smarter than us in some specific ways. But overall, we used to be the most cognitively advanced being, and now increasingly we are facing the future, or even the reality now, where we are interacting with algorithms that seem to be silly and stupid in some ways, but then tremendously smart in other ways. And it's actually very easy to overlook how smart they are, because as human species, we are so quick at getting used to things, right? Like, one of the main reasons that we have brains for is to enable communication between the members of our species, right? Like, we put a lot of brain power into trying to express our thoughts and communicate them to others in the most efficient and persuasive way. Now, try to beat a computer at communicating over the distances of thousands of miles in milliseconds while sending, terabytes of data. It's extremely difficult to do. Our memory is a great, biological device that allows us to store enormous amounts of information, but it turns out that computers can, when it comes to especially some types of information, such as visual or audio information, can beat us extremely easily.
Mm-hmm. So let's say, you had the possibility to choose between two alternatives. When you're attending a job interview, you're the candidate, you can either be interviewed by a panel of well-meaning and well-trained HR professionals who have a job profile and your CV and all the other traditional information, or you can be profiled or evaluated by the most advanced algorithm put together today, which can access all of the data that are available on you today, freely and without any kind of privacy concern. Which of the two options would you prefer as a candidate? The human or the automated kind of tech option?
Well, what I guess an average candidate would prefer, and what I would prefer actually as an average candidate myself, is, my intuitive response would be, of course, I would prefer to hang out with a bunch of people. And I probably personally would have a better time. I would probably feel a bit less judged because, there are humans like me, they have their own imperfections and so on. But again, there's enormous amount of evidence that if you look for fair and just assessment and helping me to find opportunities and career opportunities and find jobs that will help me to thrive and contribute to society in best possible way, then the algorithm is going to be much better than the panel of human judges.
Mm-hmm. And out of all the data signals that are available, if there weren't any legal or even ethical constraints, which do you think are the ones that are most predictive, most indicative, and maybe even more counterintuitive in the sense that people don't appreciate the power, the predictive power? If you can look at everything out there, your Spotify playlist, your Netflix viewing preferences, what you buy on Amazon, what you say on WhatsApp, natural language processing, face, physical feature, what you read, the sites you visit, even, or especially maybe when you want to delete the cookies in your browser, what's the most revealing signal about you and the most predictive data point we would want to consider?
I guess it very much depends on what you want to predict. So if you want to predict my skills as a coder, then probably observing me code and analyzing the code I've written in the past will be the best type of digital footprint that I've left that you may want to analyze. If you want to see how I behave when I interact with others, then getting all of those recordings from Alexa that is listening to us as we speak now as well, and I probably just activated her now, that would be a very good type of a signal. If you want to see whether I'm good at learning and passing on knowledge, then studying some records from the online e-learning platform would be best. But I think the bottom line is that essentially, if we have a psychological trait that is meaningful and significant and consequential, I think that's the best word. If you have a psychological trait, property that is consequential, then a safe assumption, the kind of by definition, a consequential trait, psychological trait would have consequences. And probably not just in one area of our life. The same ability that helps us to become a great coder, or the same ability that helps us to solve mathematical equations will be also expressed in our everyday life, how we negotiate our contracts, how we interact with our spouses or friends, and so on. And in the same way, how you behave with your wife at home is highly indicative of how you're going to interact with a very different type of a relationship or relation, which is your colleague at work.
So let's stay with that idea, which I like a lot. And, you know, I must say that, well, first, I think you're very open-minded because you come from a computer science background, and yet you've always paid a lot of attention to the theoretical relevance of traits, you know, things not coming from mainstream personality or psychology research, and understanding that sometimes algorithms are going to be black box and not theoretical. You still see the value of traits and theories and models that are based on psychology. So let's stay with that, right, and talk about the trait that signals open-mindedness, which is openness to new experience. Historically, for example, people would give you a self-report and ask you 5 questions about your openness to experience and want to predict political attitudes or voting intentions, right? Now, we don't need to ask the question. We could take a bunch of signals that are out there or data from different environments to actually achieve similar or maybe even superior predictive power. What would be examples of these new signals, digital signals that AI could scrape and use to create a profile or a score for your openness to new experience and predict your voting or political preferences?
So I would argue that essentially virtually any type of signal will be predictive of your open-mindedness, simply because your open-mindedness affects not only your voting preferences, but also the books you read. So let's look at your Kindle history. It affects the website you visit. Let's look at your browsing history. It affects what you're going to eat. Let's look at your, Amazon grocery purchase history. It affects the places you would attend, the kind of clubs and restaurants and bars you would go to. Let's analyze your GPS location history. It affects the kind of people you interact with. Let's just look at type of people you hang out on Facebook or are connected on Facebook, or just look at the Bluetooth history of your phone. And if in the Bluetooth history of your phone, we can see that there's a lot of other Bluetooth signals from phones of people that we know are liberal, then hey, guess who is hanging out with liberal people? Other liberal people, and they hang out at the same places and so on. So essentially, pick a type of digital footprint that we leave behind. And I bet that it's going to be predictive of a consequential trait, such as openness to experience.
So I guess everything is a signal, and everything has a different strength as a signal, right? So some signals are stronger than others. And sometimes there might be the same data point might kind of conflate signals that are going into opposite directions, right? I was thinking in Florida, at least, whether you wear a mask or not, it's probably a very strong predictor of your voting preferences or intentions.
But not if you're a medical doctor.
Yes, exactly. But I was going to say, even though probably high openness is associated with sensation seeking and thrill seeking, which would make wearing a mask a bit less an unconventionality, so maybe you want to go against the norm and not wear a mask, but also if you are kind of more Democrat leaning and socialist or kind of a liberal in one sense of the world, you're wearing a mask, etc. So I guess the role of AI would be to determine the strength and the direction of the signals and then pick what works.
So Thomas, actually the interesting thing is that you gave an example of kind of a traditional way of thinking about psychology, right? Let's just try to find a signal wearing a mask and try to use some theories or intuitions or some experience from the past to try to interpret what wearing a mask would mean. And this is just not the best way of going about predicting things. If
you would just go empirical way. If it predicts, helps classify correctly, you keep it. If not, it goes away.
Exactly. And interestingly, this is precisely how human brain works when it comes to tasks that we're really good at. When you teach a kid to distinguish between a cat and a dog, you don't explain, look, cats look like that, or dogs look like that, and dogs have a fur that's slightly different. You can't do this because there's so many exceptions to the rule that even if you write books about, how all of the potential ways of distinguishing, between cats and the dogs, there will be a cat or a dog that would just defy the rule and then you would make a mistake. Or if you look at the cat or a dog from some specific angle. Now, how we teach the children is that we show them cats and dogs and say, this is a cat, this is a dog, this is a cat and a dog, and the child makes some guesses. They will make some mistakes at the beginning, but very quickly when you correct them, without giving them any rules, just giving them examples of cats and dogs, the deep neural network in the brain will essentially pick up the rules that are probably way too complicated for us to put in words or describe in form of the algorithm. And we are experts at distinguishing between cats and dogs, or men and women, just based on the faces. And it's precisely the same applies to computer algorithms these days. Instead of trying to explain to them point by point, how to distinguish between Republicans or conservatives, cats and dogs, or people that are going to be great salesmen, or people that are going to be great engineers, we give computers examples, and then they spot patterns that are probably way too complicated for a human brain to even express formally in words, and then use those patterns to very powerfully and very accurately predict the future.
But wouldn't you argue that if it is a possibility, it's still nice to have a layer of understanding and explanation that goes beyond the prediction, right? So I would like to know, for example, why high IQ people like curly fries on Facebook. And maybe you have an explanation for it. I know why they like it now after reading your paper, but is there an explanation for the original finding?
Look, that's a very interesting point that you're making, that I completely understand that understanding of a phenomenon would be really nice to have. It would be really nice to have to exactly understand how cosmos works and how physics works and how chemistry works. And yet we have essentially a species long, as our history of our species is using phenomena to our advantage that we have very little experience of or understanding of. Let me give you one example. Our brain is an ultimate black box. We do not really know exactly how it works. We are very far away from understanding even, just broader and larger mechanisms that, are at work in our brains. And yet we have been using those black boxes forever to solve extremely complex problems. And it would be nice to have to understand how a brain works, but even without an understanding, we are putting it to work and achieving great things.
Yeah. That's a great line. I read a headline maybe a few months ago, and I think the Wall Street Journal saying something along the lines of, watch out, a black box algorithm might determine whether you get your next job or not, by kind of, basically they were talking about video interviewing or digital interviewing. And my reaction was, they mean the human brain, because every human interviewer who has ever interviewed someone else is a black box that is making pretty serendipitous decisions. At least we can't kind of reverse engineer it or unpack it or double click on it to see why they hired you or not, right? Whereas with AI, at least if you build or you identify the algorithm, you know what the formula or the recipe was to reach a decision.
Yes, and there's this interesting phenomenon. Of course, algorithm is more accurate at matching us with jobs. Now, one problem is that because an algorithm can be very easily applied to millions of people, potentially even some past candidates. So you can essentially take some archive cases and apply one algorithm to hundreds of thousands of millions of those in a very short time. You cannot do this with a human recruiter. So now what becomes apparent, and it really hurts people, is that now you can very clearly show that this algorithm, it might be more accurate than a human being while making predictions, but it's also going to be to some extent unfair. Maybe it's prejudiced against men or women or black people, white people, or old people, young people. There's definitely some biases that are in the decision-making process of this algorithm, to which the intuitive reaction, of course, is, well, we cannot allow an algorithm that is somewhat biased to be used in practice. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, this is just an oversimplified thinking because, first of all, no decision-making process can be perfect and perfectly accurate. So whenever we make predictions about the future, there's always going to be some noise, and there's always going to be some bias. Essentially, if you demand perfection, you're never going to get it. Just every algorithm is going to be to some extent imperfect. So now, once we accepted this point that every decision-making process, whether it's a human being or an algorithm, is going to be to some extent biased and unfair, now the question becomes, which of those players is less unfair? And the beauty of an algorithm is that it doesn't get offended when it's being told, hey, you seem to be prejudiced against whatever class of people. Can you please correct that? And that the algorithm would just have absolutely no problem, would not take it personally, it can be immediately corrected. And we have a lot of evidence, just study after study, showing that when algorithms are being used in justice system to replace the judges, or in recruitment to replace recruiters, the decisions that they make are less racist, sexist, and ageist than the equivalent decisions made by human judges. So essentially, when we think about introducing new technologies, the measure that we should not be judging them against perfection because it's not achievable. We should be judging them against alternatives. So if you can replace a human judge with an algorithm, and this algorithm is going to be more fair than a human judge and cheaper and never gets tired, and it's going to be making also more accurate predictions of the future, the question for me, this is not even a question to me, we totally should do it as quickly as possible. And there's this interesting point that people say, hey, let's wait with those algorithms, we are not sure yet and so on. And I guess that, I understand that worry, and I think that we should be cautious in making big decisions like that. But we should also remember that each day, each month or year that we postpone replacement of, let's say, human judges with algorithms, we are paying a price in people that sit in prisons or don't get jobs or don't get the chance to get an education that otherwise would get such a chance and deserve to get such a chance, or deserve not to go to prison, or deserve to get a job, and they're just not getting it because we're using a more inaccurate and more biased way of solving those problems and predicting the future, which is essentially human judges.
So we have double standards, basically, and I guess you could apply the same to self-driving cars or autonomous vehicles versus human drivers, right? In a world with no human drivers, fewer people would die. Some people might still die, but maybe we will be scandalized when a self-driving car kills one pedestrian. And in the meantime, 250,000 people or so might die courtesy of human drivers, but that's okay. Do you think the analogy is relevant?
I spoke once with this engineer that was developing self-flying planes. And he said that even today, a modern plane, the safest way of landing a modern plane is to just ask the pilot out of the deck and throw away the key so he never or she never comes back. Because of course, autopilot would also crash a plane from time to time, but the likelihood is much higher than a human pilot will decide, oh my God, something goes wrong, I've got it, and then they crash the plane. So now my question to this engineer was, so why the hell do we still have pilots? And his answer was, well, if Boeing or Airbus crashes itself when it's flying automatically without a human being holding the controls, then those companies have to accept full responsibility. Whereas if a human crashes this vehicle, this plane, then we just blame the human. We're kind of much more willing to forgive the human than to forgive a machine. And unfortunately, we're paying a price for this kind of cognitive bias that we have, that we somehow more forgetful and forgiveful for humans than to machines. We pay the price in human lives, because even now, replacing human drivers with self-driving cars, even in this imperfect environment where some human drivers are out there are many examples in which you could, for example, for some simpler bus lines, you could already today get rid of the drivers and use AI instead, and this would totally save lives. But I guess as a society, we are not ready yet for machines, sometimes by accident, killing people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let's talk about an area that is maybe not as controversial as, death or killing people, but still, very controversial to a lot of people, which is AI or machine learning algorithms that scrape features or properties of the face, nonverbal communication, facial features, physical features. What do humans typically do with this information, whether they admit it or not, whether they are aware of it or not, and how could technology or AI do a better job inferring and predicting traits or behavior from facial features? I know that this is an area that you are researching right now. What have been the main findings or discoveries?
Well, it's an interesting question because instinctively, people know that you can predict traits from faces. Like we have absolutely no problem predicting other people's age, gender. We can easily see the fatigue or the health kind of status of a person on the face. We can very easily recognize emotions. We are expert actually.
Happiness, sadness, fear, disgust. Yeah.
Precisely. And then there's some evidence showing that, let's say, our judgments of people's faces are very predictive of how successful those people are, whether in elections or getting jobs or finding a mate. An example here would be attractiveness. We agree with each other a lot when judging other people's attractiveness, and those predictions are really consequential. So essentially, we know that we can predict some things from faces. But the moment you say, hey, can we predict character or political views of a person or their extroversion or their open-mindedness from a face, there's an immediate, response like, oh, that's absolutely not possible. And interestingly, when people say, oh, that's absolutely not possible, they say it without any evidence. They just kind of, this became a taboo subject and some time ago. And so we kind of agreed in a society, and also we agreed as psychologists, as scholars, that this is just absolutely not possible, and it's a question that shouldn't be even asked. But this has made me curious because, let me give you one example. Being extroverted and gregarious and friendly involves making friendly and happy expressions when interacting with other people. Now, if we make friendly and happy expressions when interacting with other people, we are likely to maintain such an expression also when the pictures of us are taken, let's say in social settings, right? If one of the differences between extroverts and introverts is that extroverts tend to laugh more easily and more often, if we just snap a picture of introvert and extrovert at a random time, the likelihood an extrovert is going to be laughing and smiling is just higher. So, hey, maybe there's some signal about your personality in the facial expression you have on your picture or you carry or wear on your face. But hey, when we are smiling, when you're smiling a lot, this leaves permanent traces on your face. The plastic surgeons know very well that if you smile a lot, you develop different patterns of wrinkles on your face. So smile lines. So now it turns out that maybe even if you're a sleeping extrovert or extrovert under anesthesia or extrovert that tries really hard to look introverted, maybe it's just impossible to erase completely from your face all of those traces of previous smiles and laughs that you expressed on it, which drove me to the conclusion that maybe it is possible actually to judge people's character, the psychological intimate traits, just from looking at their faces. And I've been for quite some time now running analysis of images, both volunteered by people from their Facebook profiles or volunteered to us in a lab context where we just take highly standardized images of expressionless faces. And it turns out that those standardized facial images are extremely revealing of people's intimate traits, such as political views or sexual orientation or personality.
Let's talk about the political views, right? Let's to simplify, focus on the US, where you mostly have two parties, and there's quite a clear-cut, division between voting orientation and a lot of the underpinning attitudes towards, the state, the economy, healthcare, guns, religion, abortion, etc. Not perfectly, of course, but a lot of that is kind of conflated and polarized. What are the, if there are any theoretically interpretable signals of the face, and whether they are physical or more posture-like, what are some of the signals that connect to voting or political preferences or orientations? And is there, in some instances, a theoretical explanation for that? I know, we were speaking offline about the different paths through which this can happen or not. So a lot of people will have never thought that this is possible, by the way. So please enlighten us.
So some types of signal are obvious. Let's say we know that women in the United States tend to vote more liberal. So if you can recognize from someone's face they're female, you can update their belief about their political views. The same relates to age, ethnicity, and a bunch of other kind of easy observable demographic characteristics.
So older people tend to vote more conservative, and there's various explanation for that. Ethnicity, we know as well. So those are the obvious ones, right?
Correct. But it turns out that even if you control for all that, so you take, let's say, two Caucasian females of the same age, and you show them to a computer, pictures of two people like that to a computer will still be able, with very high accuracy, tell you which one of them is likely to vote liberal. And I personally thought at the beginning that maybe it's because liberals and conservatives tend to adopt different facial expressions. And this is true, because liberals and conservatives tend to grow up in different families and in different cultural backgrounds. There are differences in education, there are differences in activities, there are differences in types of jobs that liberals and conservatives prefer. It turns out that liberals and conservatives smile differently, and even human judges can distinguish between conservative and liberal smile. They cannot describe the differences, but it turns out that they can see this difference. They're not very accurate, but they're much better than random. So I thought it's mostly in facial expression, but then we ran additional wave of studies where we instructed people to maintain neutral facial expression and carefully made sure that their faces were really expressionless. And then it turns out that the accuracy of a computer increased even further, revealing that facial expression, in fact, while potentially to some extent revealing about political orientation, is also just adding the noise to the picture, right? Like our shape of our face changes where we smile or have a very heavy expression or unhappy expression. It turns out that just pictures of standardized neutral faces are as revealing, if not more, of political orientation as faces, of expressionless faces. And when I say revealing, I'm talking about extremely high accuracy. It turns out that a computer algorithm is as good when it comes to predicting your political orientation from your face as it is at predicting some very obvious things, such as your emotional expression. So if you show a computer two pictures of a sad and a happy person, a disgusted and afraid person, the accuracy of a computer algorithm distinguishing between those two facial expressions will be as high as the accuracy of the computer distinguishing between political orientations given two neutral faces.
So, I guess aside of the surprise that some people might feel when they hear this, a lot of people might get concerned or worried about, the potential misuses, unethical or political kind of abuses of this information, right? If I would imagine governments of a certain kind want to suppress dissidents, they could use CCTV camera or footage to, sort of, it's a combination of forensic policing and the most
and they're already doing this.
Okay, so
that's the interesting thing, that just to anticipate your question here, of course,
yes.
Communism government, that in technologies. I lost you, Thomas, because of the battery.
Yeah, let me see if we are still, maybe we have some interference here from those places. Let's see, one sec.